The floorboard was empty. Sandra Carlson dropped to her knees and pressed both hands into the hollow beneath it, running her fingers across every corner, every edge, as if touch could produce what her eyes had already confirmed was gone. The journal was not there. 3 years of secrets. 3 years of feelings she had never been permitted to breathe aloud. 3 years of writing about a man she had absolutely no right to love. And now it was gone. Her mind moved fast and ugly through every possibility. Who had been in her quarters? Who would have looked beneath a loose floorboard in the lower east wing of the Iron Vale stronghold? Who in all of this territory, this cold, wolf-ruled, ancient place, would dare? And every single answer she assembled, no matter how she arranged it, led to the same place. The same man. The same gray eyes and the same deliberate stillness and the same quality of attention that had undone her every single time it had turned in her direction without meaning to. She pressed her palm flat against the cold stone and told herself to breathe. Told herself to think. To be methodical. To be the careful, invisible, functionally useful woman she had spent 3 years becoming. Then she stopped thinking entirely, and she ran. She ran through the side gate of the Iron Vale stronghold, across the rain-soaked training grounds where the mud still held the prints of yesterday's sparring wolves, past the border oaks that marked the edge of the territory's formal boundary, and did not stop until she reached the collapsed watchtower at the far edge of Iron Vale land, the one place no wolf would think to look for her. She pushed the rotted door shut and pressed her back against the stone and squeezed her eyes closed and told herself she was safe here. That no one knew about this place. That she had time to think. That everything could still be managed. Then the knock came. Quiet. Deliberate. The knock of someone who had known exactly where she would go. Quick pause. Comment where you're watching from. And if you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. I've got a lot more coming. Chapter 1. What she wrote. She had arrived at Iron Vale 3 years ago in late autumn, when the frost had not yet committed itself to the ground but promised it would soon. She was 19 years old, new to the position of healer's assistant, and she had been told by her placement elder that the alpha king of the Iron Vale pack was a man of uncommon severity, a ruler who had inherited a fractured territory at the age of 22 and had spent the years since shaping it into something precise and unyielding and genuinely feared among the 5 northern packs. What she had not been told was how the stronghold would look in that light. How the stone walls of the keep caught the last of the afternoon and turned something old and cold into something that resembled, briefly and without apology, a cathedral. How the wolves who moved through those corridors carried themselves with a particular gravity, not the menace of pack culture she had read about and steeled herself against, but something quieter than menace. The weight of purpose, of belonging to a place that asked something real from you. She had not expected to feel it pull at her. She had not expected to want to belong. Marta, the elder healer, had met her at the east entrance with the energy of someone who had been given an assistant and intended to use her fully. She was 63, half a head shorter than Sandra, with fingers so efficient and unhurried in the healing ward that watching them work was like watching someone who had made a private agreement with time. She asked Sandra 2 questions on the first morning, what do you know and what do you not know yet? And then spent the next 3 months filling the second category with everything she considered essential. It was a good life. It was a quiet life. It was exactly what Sandra had told herself she needed, which was a context in which she could be useful without being visible, and in which the vast, private territory of her own interior could remain entirely her own. She had found the journal in her 3rd week. A small leather-bound thing with a gray wolf bone clasp, washed clean by river water and deposited on the north bank as though the river had decided she needed it. She had carried it back to her quarters and set it on the window ledge and looked at it for 2 evenings before she opened it. She was not a journal keeper. She was a woman who believed that writing something down made it more real, and there were things she preferred to keep at the level of almost real, where they could be managed. The first entry was 14 words. She wrote them in late November, 3 weeks after her arrival, on an evening when the snow had finally made good on its promise and the stronghold was sealed in white and the fireplace in the lower east wing crackled against the dark. She had been crossing the inner courtyard with a basket of medicinal bark, moving quickly, head down against the cold. He had been standing at the far end near the war room entrance, speaking with two of his senior enforcers, and she had not noticed him until she was close enough that looking away would have been conspicuous. So she had looked. And he had, in the middle of a sentence to his men, glanced sideways at her, not with command, not with assessment, simply with attention, and nodded once, in the way of someone who sees a person and acknowledges that they are there. Then he returned to his conversation. It was nothing. It was entirely nothing. She told herself this for 4 steps, and then stopped walking and stood in the snow and accepted that it was not, in fact, nothing, and that the problem she had been vaguely aware of for 3 weeks had just announced itself with the clarity of a struck bell. She went back to her quarters. She opened the journal. She wrote, "He looked at me like I was something worth the looking." And then the entries began, as things of that nature tend to, slowly, and then not slowly at all. She was careful. This is the thing she told herself most consistently across those 3 years, that she was careful. She did not write his name. She developed a private shorthand, the king, the man, the wolf with the gray eyes, and she tucked the journal beneath the loose flagstone in her floor, and she pressed it into that hollow, and she told herself it was safe because she had never given anyone a reason to look for it. She had no enemies. She had no alliances that created enemies. She was, by every observable measure, exactly what she appeared to be, a quiet, capable assistant who showed up when asked, did not ask for things that had not been offered, and moved through the life of the stronghold like water finding its level. What she did not account for, what 3 years of careful invisibility had not prepared her for, was a storm in the 3rd week of November that damaged 2 window latches in the lower east corridor. What she did not account for was a methodical man, standing in the stone passage with a tool and a purpose, feeling the give of an improperly set flagstone beneath his boot. What she did not account for was the quality of attention she had written about so many times, turned now not outward at the courtyard but downward, at a hollow in her floor, and the small leather-bound thing inside it. She had been so careful. She had built 3 years of safety out of smallness and silence, and the certainty that what was hidden would stay hidden. And then the floorboard was empty, and everything she had built was gone. Chapter 2. Who has it? The first thing she did, the thing before running, the thing before the watchtower, the thing she forced herself to do while her hands were still pressed against the cold stone floor of her quarters and her mind had not yet committed to panic, was think. She was good at thinking. Marta had said so in the first month, which from Marta constituted the equivalent of a standing ovation. You see the whole thing before you respond to any part of it, the old healer had said, watching Sandra work through a complicated wound presentation on a young pack enforcer who had been too proud to report his injury promptly. Most people respond to the loudest part. You look at the whole thing first. That is the difference between someone who is useful and someone who is merely busy. She used that now. She made herself breathe, and she looked at the whole thing. Who had access to her quarters? The lower east wing housed 6 people, herself, 3 other healers' assistants, a senior record keeper named Dagna, and Marta herself, whose own rooms were directly beside the main ward at the end of the hall. The wing was not high security, it was not the Alpha's quarters or the war room or the armory, but it was not a public space either. Entry required a specific key that the pack's quartermaster distributed carefully, and the only outsiders who moved through it with any regularity were the enforcement officers on the New Moon quarters sweep and whoever happened to be accompanying a patient to the ward. Marta was not the explanation. Sandra was as certain of this as she was certain of anything. Marta held absolute respect for the private lives of her people, and she was also, as Sandra had observed across 3 years, deeply, fundamentally uninterested in other people's business unless their business intersected with the healing ward. The enforcement sweep was a possibility. She had never been present during one, and she knew from Dagna that the officers moved methodically and quickly through the space, but they were looking for weapons, for contraband, for things that posed a risk to pack security. A loose flagstone was not, on its face, their concern, unless someone had told them to look more carefully. And then there was Brennan. She did not want to think about Brennan, so she made herself think about him precisely and without sentiment. He had come to her quarters 2 weeks ago on an errand that had not quite felt like an errand. He was the pack beta, Tegan's younger brother, dark where Tegan was golden gray, charming where Tegan was contained, and he had stood in the doorway of her room with a medicinal request that any one of the 3 other assistants could have fulfilled and would have, had he asked them. He had looked at the room with the easy, proprietary attention of someone conducting an informal inventory. He had not looked at the floor. Or rather, she had not noticed him looking at the floor. She went to Marta. She did not tell Marta what she was looking for. She framed it as a concern about a personal item, a family keepsake, she said, a small thing of sentimental value that she could not locate and was worried might have been displaced during the last week's cleaning. Had anyone been in the lower east wing that Marta knew of, outside of the usual staff? Marta had looked at her for a long moment with the expression she wore when she was deciding how much of the truth to extend. It was not an unkind expression. It was simply the expression of a woman who had lived long enough to understand that the truth, offered in full, was not always the kindest thing to give. The Alpha King was in this wing 4 days ago, Marta said finally. He came himself, not through Kale. He said he was seeing to the window damage from the storm. The 2 latches on the north side of the corridor had needed repair since the 3rd week of November, and he had apparently grown impatient waiting for the maintenance report to be actioned. She paused. He was here for perhaps an hour. An hour. Sandra pressed her hand flat against the wall beside Marta's door and accepted what that meant. He had not sent maintenance. He had come himself. He had been in her corridor for an hour. And the flagstone had been slightly displaced by the storm's pressure shifts, which happened in old stonework, which she had been meaning to have fixed, and had not because she feared drawing attention to that particular section of floor. "Thank you," she said to Marta. Marta looked at her for one more moment with that measuring expression, and then said, "Sandra, whatever you're going to do next, do it carefully." And then she turned back to her medicines, because Marta had always believed that advice was most useful when it was short. Sandra walked back to her quarters and stood in the center of the room, and looked at the empty floor and understood, fully and completely, that there was nowhere to go except the one place she had kept entirely her own. And so she ran for the watchtower, and she pressed her back against the stone, and she closed her eyes, and she waited for the knock that she already knew was coming. Chapter 3. The Watchtower. She had found the Watchtower in her 4th month at Iron Vale, during a long walk she had taken on a rest day when the stronghold had felt too loud in the way that quiet places sometimes do, not with noise, but with the weight of other people's lives pressing against the walls. She had followed the tree line east until she found the tower, collapsed on one side, the roof half gone, the door hanging on one hinge and leading into a space roughly the size of a merchant's stall. The hearth was still intact. The eastern wall had a gap at eye level where a window had been, now open to the forest, and whatever light the canopy chose to give. She had gone back 12 times in the 1st year, more in the 2nd, less in the 3rd, because in the 3rd year she had begun to worry that the frequency of her visits was creating a visible pattern, and she could not afford visible patterns. She had brought tinder and a small supply of wood, and had cached them in the corner behind the fallen beam. She had never told anyone. Not Marta, not Dagna, not the 3 other assistants with whom she shared the corridor and ate breakfast, and exchanged the comfortable small talk of people who occupied the same space, without fully inhabiting each other's lives. It was hers. The only thing in Iron Vale that was entirely and only hers, except for the journal, and now the journal was not hers anymore. The fire she had managed to light was small, pressed into the old hearth, more warmth than light. She sat with her back against the intact wall, knees drawn up, and she looked at the dark gap where the window had been, and she told herself to think clearly. She told herself that there were outcomes here that did not end in catastrophe. She told herself that the Alpha King was a just man. She had seen evidence of this repeatedly across 3 years, had in fact written about it in the journal more than once. The way he managed disputes, the way he listened before he spoke, the way he did not punish people for honesty. But the journal was not honesty in any ordinary sense. The journal was 3 years of a woman writing about her Alpha King with the full, unguarded transparency of someone who had believed, absolutely and completely, that no one would ever read it. She had written about the shape of his hands, She had written about the quality of his attention. She had written, in one entry she could barely think about directly, about a night she had watched him train alone in the courtyard in the pre-dawn dark, moving through the forms with a focus so complete it was nearly devotional, and about how she had watched from the upper passage for longer than she should have, and written afterward that she understood for the first time what people meant when they talked about something being almost too much to look at. She pressed her palms against her eyes. The knock came. It was quiet. It was deliberate. It was not the knock of someone who had stumbled here by chance. It was not the knock of someone trying the door on a guess. It was the knock of someone who had known where she was going before she got there, who had, perhaps, known for longer than that. It had 2 beats, and then a pause, and then a third. Patient. Almost courteous. The knock of a man who understood that she had earned at least this much, the right to decide whether to open the door. She sat perfectly still for 3 full seconds. The fire crackled once. The forest beyond the window gap was entirely silent. She did not go to the door. She did not call out. What she did was sit up straight against the wall and press her feet flat to the floor and fold her hands in her lap and make herself stop shaking, because she was shaking, had been shaking since the moment in her quarters when she had understood what the empty floor meant, and she was not going to be shaking when the door opened. Because it would open. She knew that. And she was not going to run again. The door moved on its single hinge. Slowly. The firelight from the small hearth reached forward into the gap and found him, found the edge of his armor, the fur of his cloak, the journal held against his chest with one hand, and then his face, and the expression on it, which was not what she expected. She had expected authority. She had expected the careful, contained neutrality he wore when managing difficult situations. What she had not expected, what she could not have prepared herself for, was what was actually there. He looked, for just a moment, like a man who was afraid. Not of her. Not of the situation. Of something that ran beneath all of that. Some risk he was holding that had nothing to do with pack politics or her transgression or any of the practical dimensions of this encounter. And then the moment passed, and he was himself again, steady and present and impossible to fully read, and he stepped into the doorway, and he looked at her where she sat against the wall, and he said 5 words. I've read every word. She did not look away. She did not speak. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her feet flat on the cold stone floor, and she held his gaze, and she stayed exactly where she was. She did not run. Chapter 4. What he found. He did not enter fully. He stood in the doorway with the journal held against his chest, and the forest dark behind him, and he looked at her, and he let the silence run its course, which told her something about him that she had not needed the journal to know, that he understood silence the way she did, that he did not fill it, that he believed what was said in silence had as much weight as what was said in words. When he finally spoke, his voice was even, not cold, not the temperature of authority or judgment. Even in the way of someone who is choosing each word with care, not because he is calculating, but because he understands that the words matter, and he does not want to misuse them. I found it 4 days ago, he said. I came to see to the window latches myself. The maintenance report had been sitting unanswered for 3 weeks, and I had grown impatient with it. The flagstone shifted under my boot when I stepped over the threshold. It had been displaced by the pressure shifts during the storm. He paused. I did not go looking. She believed him. She believed this with the part of her that had spent 3 years watching him conduct himself in difficult situations, and the part that could feel, even now, that he was not offering her a convenient story. He was accounting for himself. There was a difference. He continued. I saw the leather cover and the clasp. I recognized it as personal, not pack property. I should have set it aside without opening it. He met her eyes fully. I did not do that. She waited. I read the first entry, and I told myself to stop. It was a reasonable thing to tell myself. He was quiet for a moment. I did not stop. I read to the end. Then I went back and read certain entries a second time. The fire behind her crackled softly. Through the gap in the wall, the forest held its breath. She was aware of everything with the particular sharpness that comes when the body understands it is at an edge. The roughness of the stone beneath her palms, the smell of cold air and pine, and the faint metal and forge scent of his armor, The way his hands around the journal were not careless, were in fact entirely deliberate, as though he had been holding it carefully for 4 days and intended to continue. He held it out toward her. "This belongs to you," he said. "It has always belonged to you." She crossed the distance between them and took it from his hands. His fingers held it for one additional moment before releasing, not possessively, but as though making sure she had it properly before letting go. The leather was warm from where he had carried it against his chest. She stood before him with the journal in her hands, and she looked up at him, and she said, "What do you intend to do?" It was not a question. She did not have the inflection for questions in that moment. It came out as a statement of what she needed to know, which amounted to the same thing. He considered this. Not in the way of someone who is deciding what answer will cause least damage. In the way of someone who is identifying the truest answer and making sure it is the one he offers. "Nothing that is in that journal will be used against you," he said. "Nothing that is in that journal will leave this tower unless you choose to speak it yourself." He paused. "That is not why I came." She waited. He reached into the inside of his cloak and drew out a single page, folded once. Not part of the journal's binding, but a page she recognized immediately because she had torn it carefully from the back. The night she had written the entry she could not afford to leave between the other pages, the entry that was coded in pack cipher and which she had told herself, after she wrote it, that she would eventually burn. She had not burned it. She had kept it in the journal because the journal was the only safe place she had, and apparently she had been wrong about that. He held the page out to her, folded side up. She did not take it. He said, "I need to ask you about this. Not in my capacity as Alpha King, or rather, not only in that capacity." He looked at her steadily. "Will you let me?" The fire had settled into its quieter rhythm. Outside, the first of the real night wind was moving through the high branches of the border oaks. She thought, distantly, that the walk back to the stronghold in this cold would be uncomfortable. She thought, less distantly, that she had crossed a line approximately 40 minutes ago when she had not run, when she had sat still and let the door open, and that the line was not one she was going to step back across now. "Yes," she said. "Ask me whatever you need to ask." Chapter 5. The Coded Entry. She had learned the pack cipher in her 3rd week at Iron Vale, in the same way she had learned everything from Marta, without ceremony, alongside 17 other things of equal apparent importance. Marta had pressed a single sheet of symbols into her hand and said, "The herb records are kept in cipher so that they cannot be falsified by anyone who does not have access to the key. You will memorize this. Not write it down, memorize it." Sandra had memorized it in a single evening because that was the kind of thing her mind did with systems it found useful, and filed it away alongside the medicinal compound ratios and the pack's hierarchy of formal address and the 17 other things Marta had given her that week. She had used it once. One entry. One night. The entry she had written in the hours after Brennan had come to the healing ward following the Southern enforcement action in which a young pack member named Oren had taken 3 broken ribs. She had treated Oren herself. He was 23, quiet, with a careful way of describing things that suggested he had learned to choose his words with a precision that did not come naturally to men his age. He had told her, while she worked on the 2nd rib, that the enforcement action had not been what the report would say it was. That he had not provoked the enforcers. That he had asked a question, a simple question about the justification for the seizure of a Southern Sector family's food stores, and that the response had been immediate and coordinated in a way that did not suggest spontaneity. He told her this quietly and without drama, and he asked her, equally quietly, to record what she observed in her own assessment rather than what the enforcement report would likely say. She had done this. She had written a clean, factual, medically accurate account of the injuries she had treated and the circumstances as described to her by the patient, and she had filed it in the ward records as was her professional obligation. And then, 2 hours after she filed it, Brennan had come. He had not raised his voice. He had not made threats. He had stood in the doorway of the ward with his shoulder wound, a real wound. She could see that, though a trivial one, and he had waited until they were alone, and then he had said, very quietly, that Oren had been known to exaggerate. That the enforcement action in the Southern Sector had been clean and properly authorized. That her records should reflect the original report, not the narrative of a young wolf with an axe to grind against pack authority. He had smiled at her when he said it. He was very good at smiling. She had not changed the records. She had also understood, from the particular quality of that smile, that she was now in possession of something dangerous, and that the danger was not merely professional. That night she had opened the journal and written, in cipher, in the back, on a page, she pressed flat against the binding so it would not be noticed easily. Everything she had observed. The date. Oren's account. The injury assessment. Brennan's visit. The exact words he had used. The exact words she had said in return. And then she had folded the page and pressed it into the journal and gone to sleep. She told all of this to Tegan standing in the collapsed watchtower with the fire low behind her and her journal in her hands, and she told it straight, the way she had learned to do with Marta, without sentiment, without preemptive apology, without the hedging that women in her position often learn to wrap around difficult truths. She told it because he had asked her to, and because she had decided, in the moment the door opened, that she was done conducting herself in a way that required her to be smaller than the truth. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at the page in his hands, the cipher page, which he had unfolded now and held in the firelight, and she could see that he had decoded it, that the marks he had made in the margins were his notation from the deciphering, that he had spent real time on this. "Is this accurate?" he said. "Every detail?" She met his gaze and held it without flinching. "Yes," she said. "Every word of it." He folded the page again. He folded it with the same care he had used when holding the journal, deliberately, without carelessness. He held it for a moment, and then he said, more to himself than to her, "I've been looking at the Southern enforcement records for 4 months." She said nothing. She waited. He looked up. The expression on his face was not the expression of a man who had just received new information. It was the expression of a man who had just received the final piece of something he had already assembled most of, a confirmation, not a revelation, but the kind of confirmation that changes everything because without it, everything you know is still only almost enough. "I suspected," he said. "I have been careful not to act until I was certain." He looked at her. "This makes me certain." Chapter 6. The Weight of Loyalty. There was a kind of silence that Sandra had come to understand, across 3 years of living in Iron Vale, was particular to men like Tegan Olsen, men who had been given authority young and had learned to carry it the way you carry something genuinely heavy, not by pretending it weighs nothing, and not by letting it bend you, but by developing the specific musculature required to hold it upright without stumbling. He set the coded page down carefully on the broken stone ledge between them, not discarding it, but placing it with intention, the way you put down something you have been carrying for a long time and have decided not to carry alone anymore. He turned toward the gap in the wall and looked out at the dark border forest, and he was quiet. She did not try to fill the silence. She sat with her journal in her lap and her hands folded over the wolfbone clasp, and she waited because she had learned, in her own way and for her own reasons, how to hold weight without stumbling, and this seemed like the kind of moment that asked for that. "Brennan is my brother," he said finally. He said it carefully, not as a defense, not as a preemptive explanation for inaction. He said it the way you name the full dimension of a problem. "Here is what this costs, here is what the choice requires. My blood, the beta of this pack, the man I appointed and trusted and have stood beside for every year of my rule." "I know," Sandra said. He turned from the gap in the wall and looked at her. "I have found discrepancies in the Southern enforcement records," he said. "Not 1 or 2 patterns. Actions that should not have been taken, justifications that do not hold under scrutiny, resources that were redirected in ways that require an authorization I did not give." He paused. "I've been investigating quietly through Kale because the moment I bring this to the senior wolves without sufficient evidence, it becomes a political rupture, a challenge to pack legitimacy. Brennan will call it a betrayal and half the circle will believe him because he is very good at being believed." Sandra looked at the coded page on the ledge between them. She thought about Oren, young, precise, careful with his words, 3 broken ribs, and the wit to tell a healer quietly what he could not afford to say in an official record. She thought about the ward records she had filed and which Brennan had come to her expecting to change, and which she had not changed, and which had sat in the filing cabinet in the lower ward for 2 weeks while she had wondered, privately, whether she had made a decision she would not be able to sustain. "I did not change the records," she said. "In case that was a question you had not yet asked." He nodded. "I know. I checked them." He paused. "That was also why I came tonight." She absorbed this. He had come for the cipher page. He had come because the cipher page was evidence he did not otherwise have, a direct account of witness tampering, written contemporaneously, in code, by someone with no reason to fabricate and every reason to stay silent. He had come because he needed it. And he had also come because he had read her journal, and those two things were happening simultaneously in the same room in the same man, and she was aware of both of them in a way that required careful management. "Until now," she said. He looked at her. "Until now," he agreed. She thought about what it meant to investigate your own brother. To spend 4 months gathering discrepancies and patterns and redirected resources carefully through a single trusted man, in the knowledge that if you moved too early you would be the one who appeared to have acted wrongly. She thought about what it cost to hold that level of certainty in isolation, to govern a territory, maintain a pack, make 200 small decisions a day about the welfare of the wolves under your authority, and carry this beneath all of it. To smile at your brother across the long hall at communal meal and give nothing away. She said, "What do you need from me?" He was quiet for a moment. "A formal accounting," he said. "Sworn. Your direct testimony about what Oren told you, what you treated, what Brennan said to you afterward, and the fact that you did not alter your records. Combined with the cipher page, as a contemporaneous record." He paused. "It will not be comfortable. The senior circle will question you. Brennan will deny everything, and there will be wolves who believe him." Sandra looked at him steadily. "You did not come all the way to the edge of your own territory in the dark," she said, "to tell me this was going to be comfortable." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, the very smallest thing, almost invisible. "Almost." "No," he said. "I did not." Chapter 7. The Pack That Watches. They returned to the stronghold separately. He went first, with the coded page, leaving her the journal and a torch he had carried from the tree line that had enough life left in it to get her back through the border oaks without difficulty. She waited 20 minutes, she counted, and then she followed. The stronghold at this hour was not asleep, exactly, but it had arranged itself into the particular configuration of an old place in the deep hours of the night. The guards at their posts, the fires banked to coal, the long hall empty of its daytime purpose and occupied only by its own long shadows. She came through the east gate and nodded to the guard, who nodded back with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned not to comment on who entered and when. She was halfway across the inner courtyard when she saw Cale. He was on the inner wall above the east corridor entrance, not patrolling, not moving, simply standing at the point where the wall jutted out and a man could see clearly in 4 directions if he chose to. He was looking at her. Not with suspicion. Cale's face rarely arranged itself into anything as transparent as suspicion. He looked at her with the practiced neutrality of a man who sees everything and volunteers nothing, and who has served this alpha long enough to understand the difference between what he is asked to notice and what he is asked to remember. She held his gaze for a moment. He did not look away. Neither did she. Then she walked on toward the east corridor, and she did not look back, and she told herself that the encounter had meant nothing, and believed approximately half of that. The following evening was communal meal in the long hall. She came late, as she sometimes did when the ward ran long, and found a place at the lower end of one of the secondary tables with Dagna and 2 of the other assistants. The hall was full. Perhaps 70 wolves at the long tables, the fire in the great hearth built up properly, the smell of food and firelight, and the contained energy of a pack at rest. She did not look at the head table immediately. She poured her water and spoke briefly to Dagna about a patient follow-up scheduled for the morning, and helped herself to bread and ate a methodical amount of everything that came her way, and conducted herself exactly as she conducted herself every other evening at communal meal. Then she looked up, and Brennan was looking at her. He was seated to his brother's left at the head table, as was appropriate for the pack beta. He was in conversation with one of the senior enforcers. She could see his mouth moving, his hands moving, the easy, social energy of a man who understood how to hold a room's attention without appearing to try. But his eyes were on her, not with menace, with calculation, the kind of look that is taking measurements. She understood from the quality of that look that he had noticed something had shifted. He did not know what it was. He did not know about the watchtower or the conversation or the coded page. But he was a man who had learned to read the currents of a pack the way a sailor reads water, and something in the current had changed, and he was already searching for the source. She returned her attention to her plate. She ate. She laughed, briefly, at something Dagna said. She conducted herself with the same quiet competence she had cultivated across 3 years, and she did not look at the head table again. That night she sat at her desk in her quarters for a long time before she opened the journal. She held it in her hands and thought about Marta's advice. Do it carefully, and about what carefully now meant in a context where the journal was no longer a secret and the Alpha King had read every word and was conducting an investigation that would, within days, reshape the entire structure of how this pack understood itself. She thought about Oren in the healing ward with his broken ribs and his careful words. She thought about what it meant to know the truth of a thing and say nothing, and she thought about what it had cost her across 3 years to say nothing, and whether she had been calling that wisdom when it was in fact only a very refined form of fear. She opened the journal. She picked up her pen. She wrote 3 words, slowly and deliberately, as a complete entry. I stood still. She closed the journal. She tied the wolf bone clasp. She pressed it against the window ledge and she looked at it for a moment. Not beneath the floor, not in a hollow, simply on the ledge where the moonlight touched it, and then she went to bed. Chapter 8. The Brothers Move. Brennan came to the healing ward at mid-morning of the following day, which was the kind of move that told her everything she needed to know about what kind of man he was. Not the move itself, the timing. Mid-morning was the ward's busiest hour. Patients at their follow-ups, Marta moving between beds, the other assistants occupied with compound preparation. It was the hour at which a visitor could arrive with a minor complaint, wait the appropriate amount of time, and have a brief conversation with the appropriate person with complete naturalness and no one in the room particularly noting the exchange. His shoulder was, as she had noted the first time, genuinely bruised, training impacts, which pack wolves accumulated constantly and ignored with the same consistency. He sat on the edge of the examination table and she assessed the bruising and he made small talk about the previous night's training session and she listened and responded at the appropriate intervals and they both waited until Marta had moved to the far end of the ward with the 3rd patient. Then he said, without any particular warmth or coldness, simply as a statement of fact, the Alpha does not keep companions. He has not, to my memory, kept companions. He paused. He looks at the welfare of the pack in a way another man might look at a relationship, with that quality of total commitment. It leaves very little room for other arrangements. She was winding the bandage around his shoulder in clean, even loops. She did not pause. She did not change her breathing. She completed the wrap and secured it and said, equally factually, I am aware of how the Alpha conducts himself. Brennan looked at her sideways. You should be careful, he said, about the stories you let people tell about you. In a pack like this, a woman in your position, a healer's assistant, not a ranked member, from outside the territory, is not well positioned to absorb certain kinds of attention. He paused. Even if that attention is not what people make of it. She tied the bandage off. She looked at him. She said, I am always careful about the stories people tell. She paused. I am considerably less careful about the ones I tell myself. He studied her for a moment. He was trying to read her, and he was good at reading people, and she let him try. She met his eyes with the same steady, factual attention she gave everything in the healing ward, and she thought about Oren, and she thought about the cipher page, and she thought about Tegan standing in the doorway of the watchtower with her journal against his chest, and the expression on his face that she had not expected. You are not what I expected, Brennan said. She began cleaning the instrument tray with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything. No, she said. I do not think I am. He stood. He rolled down his sleeve over the bandage with the unhurried ease of a man who has decided not to push any further today, Not because there is nothing more to push on, but because today is not the day he has chosen for it. He straightened his collar. He glanced around the ward with the easy, proprietary attention that seemed to be his default mode in any room, and then he looked back at her once more. "I hope," he said, "that you are as careful as you believe yourself to be, Miss Carlson."
"Thank you for coming in," she said.
"The shoulder will be fine in 3 days." She turned back to the instrument tray before he reached the door. She heard him pause, a brief pause, the pause of a man who is accustomed to having the last moment of a room, and then she heard his footsteps cross the stone floor and the door of the ward open and close. She stood for a moment with her hands on the tray. She thought about what he had said, not the threat of it because it had not quite been a threat, but the signal of it, which was that he had noticed something and was trying to determine whether it was a problem he needed to address before it became one. She thought about how much time that gave her, and Tegan and Cale, who was presumably moving pieces on a board, she could not entirely see. Then she heard Marta's voice from the far end of the ward, brisk, efficient, asking for the fennel tincture, and she put Brennan down and picked up the work and went back to being the woman she had been for 3 years. Except that she was beginning to understand she was no longer entirely that woman, and had not been, she suspected, since the moment she sat still and did not run. Chapter 9. The Senior Circle. Tegan called the senior wolves to the war room that afternoon at the 3rd hour past midday, which was the time he used for formal pack matters. Not the informal consultations he conducted at his desk in the early morning, but the official assembly of the pack's governing body, the 5 senior wolves who held rank below the alpha and beta and who had, between them, 80 years of combined experience navigating pack politics. Sandra did not hear the contents of the meeting in the war room. She heard about it afterward from Cale, who came to the healing ward at the close of the day and asked, in the particular indirect way of a man who has been trained to gather information without appearing to seek it, how she was keeping. She told him honestly, which was to say not entirely steadily, and he absorbed this and then, with the same indirectness, told her the outlines of what had been said. Tegan had presented the discrepancies in the Southern enforcement records. He had been precise, Cale said, and measured, and without visible anger, which was how he always sounded, Sandra noted internally, when a decision had already been made and nothing would unmake it. He had laid out 4 months of quiet investigation in the manner of a craftsman showing his work. Here is what I observed. Here is how I cross-referenced it. Here is what the pattern indicates. Brennan had said, "Whatever you think you found, you are reading it wrong." Tegan had said, "I have a witness." Brennan had said, "What witness?" Tegan had said, "That is not information I am sharing in this room." There had been a silence, Cale said, the kind of silence that falls on a room when the people in it are performing calculations that may change what they have believed to be true about the structure of things. And then Tegan had said, "I am asking for a formal review. Not a judgment, not an action, a review. If the records are clean, the review will confirm it, and the matter will be settled. If they are not, we owe it to every wolf in this territory to know the truth." 3 of the 5 senior wolves had agreed immediately. One had asked for time to consult the precedent records, which was the correct procedural thing to do, and which Tegan had granted. The 5th, Old Halvard, the pack's longest-serving senior wolf, who had served under Tegan's father before him, had looked at Brennan across the table for a long moment and then looked back at Tegan and said, "A witness," and said nothing else. Sandra absorbed all of this standing in the cleaning alcove at the edge of the ward while the last patient of the day received his discharge instructions from one of the other assistants. She thought about what being a witness meant, formally, in pack proceedings. She had looked this up, quietly, 2 days ago in the Stronghold's legal record room, a room she had never entered before and had needed to ask Dagna to show her, and she understood that her testimony would need to be given in the presence of the full senior circle and possibly, depending on how the review was structured, the assembled pack. She understood that Brennan would be present, that he would be given the right to question her account, that she would need to hold it under scrutiny from a man who was very skilled at making other people feel that what they remembered was not quite what had happened. She thought about Oren and about his careful words and about the way he had looked at her while she worked on his ribs, not pleading, not desperate, simply honest. She thought about what it meant to a young wolf who had asked a question about a seizure of family food stores and paid for it with 3 broken ribs, to have someone hold the truth of what happened to him without flinching. She went back to the instrument tray. She cleaned everything that needed cleaning. She recorded the day's ward notes with the same careful accuracy she brought to all her records, and then she walked down the lower east corridor to her quarters, and she stood in the center of the room and looked at the empty flagstone depression in the floor for a long moment before she turned away from it and looked instead at the journal on the window ledge, sitting in what was left of the evening light. I stood still, she had written, and she was going to keep standing still, regardless of what the standing cost her. Chapter 10. The Library at the Edge of Everything. The summons came on the evening of the 3rd day since the watchtower. It came through Kale, formally, respectfully, without drama. A brief word in the corridor outside the ward as she was finishing her end-of-day tasks, asking if she would come to the Alpha study at her convenience this evening, which in pack language meant at her earliest convenience, and which she understood to mean something else underneath that. She went. The Alpha study was a room she had passed perhaps 100 times in 3 years. It sat at the corner of the inner keep, with 2 long windows facing north and east, and she had seen the light of it from the courtyard in the late evenings and known, with the particular awareness of someone who has paid close attention to a person for a very long time, that he was in there, working, reading, conducting the interior business of governing that did not happen in war rooms or senior circles, but in the private hours when a man sits alone with the full weight of what he is responsible for and decides, again, that he can carry it. She had never been inside. The door was open. The fire was built up properly. Not the banked coals of an end-of-evening fire, but a real fire, the kind that makes a room warm and fills it with the smell of birchwood and the small sound of something alive in the grate. The room was orderly in the way of someone who uses their space functionally. Books on the shelves in the arrangement of actual use rather than decorative display, maps on the work table, correspondence stacked with the particular neatness of a man who deals with a great deal of it and has developed a system. He was standing in the center of the room, not at the window, not at the desk. Standing, facing the door, as though he had been waiting and had decided not to pretend otherwise. She stepped inside. The door stayed open. She had expected a practical conversation. She had expected the structure of what came next, the formal review, her testimony, the logistics of standing as a witness in a pack proceeding. She had prepared for this the way she prepared for difficult conversations in the ward. Clear, factual, precise, without preemptive apology. He said, "I have been thinking about how to say this without getting in my own way." She absorbed the shift. This was not the practical conversation. She looked at him, and she said, "You could simply say it." Something real and warm crossed his face at that. Not a smile, not quite, but the movement of something that wanted to be. He looked at her for a moment with the quality of attention she had spent 3 years writing about. The full weight of it turned completely in her direction, and he said, "I am in love with you. I want to be entirely clear about that. Not uncertain, not cautiously hopeful. I am in love with you, and I have been for longer than was comfortable. And I am done conducting myself in a way that prevents me from saying so." The fire held its breath. The north window had gone fully dark. Somewhere down the corridor, far away, she could hear the muffled sound of the stronghold going about the business of its evening, indifferent and ordinary and entirely outside this room. She thought about every word she had ever written in that journal. Every entry she had tied shut with the wolf bone clasp and pressed beneath the flagstone and told herself was safe and necessary and not the thing it most deeply was, which was the record of a woman who had known, from the 14th word, that she was already lost and who had spent 3 years trying to be careful about it. She thought about standing in the broken tower with her back against the stone, and the knock that had come through the dark, and him in the doorway with the firelight behind him, and the journal against his chest, and the expression on his face that she had not expected. She thought about deciding not to run, about sitting still. She said, "I stood still. I wrote it 3 nights ago in the journal, because it was the moment I knew what I was choosing. When you stood in that doorway, and I did not run. I knew exactly what I was doing." She paused. "You." "I was choosing you. I think I have been choosing you for a very long time." He crossed the distance between them without hurry. He lifted her hand from her side and held it against his chest, directly over his heart, and the gesture was so deliberate and so completely without performance, without the language of rank or authority or any of the apparatus of what he was, that every remaining defense she had built over 3 years of careful invisibility dissolved entirely. She could feel his heart beneath her palm. It was not the measured pace of a man who was calm about this. Neither was hers. They stayed there for a long time in the firelit study with the door open and the north wind moving against the long windows, and she thought about the word safe, about what it had meant to her for 3 years, the hollow under the floor, the collapsed watchtower at the edge of the territory, the smallness she had cultivated as a form of protection, and she thought about what it meant now, standing with her hand against his chest, and the whole truth of the last 3 years out in the open air, where it could be seen. It was nothing like what she had imagined safety to feel like. It was enormous and exposed and terrifying in the way of things that matter entirely. And it was, without question, safer than anything she had ever built. In her room, late, she opened the journal for the last time in the way she used to open it, alone and quiet and careful. She held it in her hands for a moment, and then she picked up her pen, and she wrote, beneath the 3 words she had written 3 nights ago, slowly and clearly. And he came to me, and I let him. She closed the journal. She tied the wolf bone clasp. And then she did something she had never done in 3 years of keeping it. She set it on the ledge by the window. Not beneath the floorboard, not tucked into a drawer, not managed into a smaller space than it deserved. She left it there in the open, small and leather-bound with its gray wolf bone clasp, like something that no longer needed to hide. Because it did not. Because she did not. Chapter 11. The Weight of Testimony. The formal review was set for the 7th day, after the watchtower. 7 days, Cale explained, was the minimum required under the Pack's legal precedent for a matter of this weight. Enough time for the senior wolves to review the written record, for the witness to prepare her account, and for the accused to arrange whatever representation he intended to bring to the circle. It was not, Cale added carefully, enough time for certain other things to happen, if those things were the kind that required opportunity and privacy, and the reasonable confidence that no one was watching. She heard this and understood it to be a warning delivered in the cleanest possible terms, and she filed it away with the same method she filed everything, precisely, without sentiment, in the part of her mind that was always, underneath everything else, keeping watch. She spent the first 3 of the 7 days preparing her account the way she prepared a difficult wound assessment. Start from what she knew with absolute certainty, layer outward from there, do not add what she inferred, and mark clearly the places where her direct observation ended and her interpretation began. She wrote it in longhand at her desk in the lower east wing with the window cracked against the cold because cold air helped her think, and she wrote it twice, and the second version was better than the first because the first had been slightly too careful in the way of someone still managing the shape of the truth, and the second was simply the truth in the order it had happened. Oren came to the healing ward on the 4th day. She had not sent for him. She had understood, from the way Cale had spoken of the review structure, that she was not the only witness, and that the formal process would locate the others without her assistance. But Oren came of his own accord, arriving at the ward's end-of-day hour when only she remained at the desk, and he stood in the doorway in the same posture she remembered from 3 months ago, not pleading, not desperate, simply honest, and he said, "I am going to speak at the review." She looked at him across the desk. He was 23 and he had 3 healed ribs, and he had come here on his own feet without anyone asking him to, and she thought, not for the first time in those 7 days, about what it cost people to tell the truth when the telling required them to stand in front of the thing that had already hurt them once and hold their ground. She thought about what it had cost her. She thought about what it had taken her 3 years to understand about the difference between careful and afraid.
"Good," she said.
She said it without ceremony because it did not need ceremony. It needed only acknowledgement.
"Good."
And then she said, "Sit down and I will tell you what the process looks like so that you are not walking into it without knowing the shape of it." He sat. She told him. She told him the way Marta had always told her difficult things, directly, without softening the parts that were hard, and without adding to them either. The circle would question him. Brennan would be present, and would have the right to challenge his account. The senior wolves were not unkind people, but they were also not people who operated on sentiment. They would want facts, sequence, specificity, and they would want them delivered without embellishment or the kind of emotional weight that gave an opponent room to argue the witness was unreliable. Could he do that? She asked him. Could he give them the facts in the order they happened and hold that account without faltering under pressure? Oren looked at her for a moment with those careful eyes. Yes, he said.
He paused.
I have been holding the facts since the night it happened. I know the weight of them. He paused again, and something that was not quite a smile moved across his face, young and grave, and entirely without bitterness. It would be good, he said, to put them down somewhere they can be used. She thought about that for a long time after he left. The weight of facts that had nowhere to go. 3 years of her own life had been, in some essential way, exactly that. The weight of a truth she had been carrying without a place to put it down. She had put it in the journal. All of it, the love and the fear and the evidence and the 3 years of watching a man govern a territory with the kind of integrity that made you understand, slowly and without meaning to, that integrity was not an abstraction, that it was a practice, that it cost something every day to maintain it. She had put all of that in the journal and pressed it under a floorboard and called it safe. On the 5th day, Tegan came to her in the corridor outside the healing ward in the early morning, before the ward opened and before most of the stronghold was fully awake. It was the first time she had seen him since the study. He stopped when he reached her, and he looked at her with the full quality of attention she had spent 3 years writing about, the weight of it undivided, and he said, quietly, "How are you?" She looked at him, and she thought about what the true answer to that was. "Ready," she said. "I think I have been ready for longer than I knew."
She paused.
"And you?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked past her toward the far window of the corridor where the early light was beginning to come through in a gray and uncommitted way that suggested the sun was trying, and the clouds were not yet decided. He said, "Brennan sent word to 4 of the outlying pack families last night. Families whose sons serve in the Southern Enforcement Units. He will have their support at the review, not because they know the facts, but because they trust him, and because trust in a pack of this size runs through familiarity and not always through evidence." Sandra absorbed this. "He is trying to shape the room before the review begins," she said. "Yes," Tegan said. "And he will try to shape your account during it. He will not be loud about it. He is very skilled at making a witness doubt the reliability of their own memory, not by challenging the facts directly, but by asking questions in a sequence that introduces ambiguity where there was none." He paused. "I am telling you this because I want you to know what is coming, not because I believe it will change what you do." She looked at him squarely.
"I know what he will try," she said.
"I've been in that room with him, and I have watched him do exactly that. Introduce ambiguity where there was none, make a woman doubt what she observed with her own hands."
She paused. "He did not succeed that time. He will not succeed this time."
Tegan held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, and with the particular care of a man who understands that some things need to be said even when saying them costs something, "Whatever the review determines, whatever the outcome, you are not carrying this alone. You understand that." She understood that. She had understood it, she thought, from the moment he had stood in the doorway of the watchtower and held her journal against his chest and looked at her with an expression she had not expected, had not known, across 3 years of careful observation, to expect from him. She had understood it in the study when he held her hand against his chest and let her feel what was underneath the composed surface of his governance. She understood it now, standing in the corridor in the early light with the ward not yet open and the stronghold beginning to arrange itself around another day. "Yes," she said. "I understand." She went into the ward. She opened the shutters and lit the lamp at the preparation table and began the morning compound check, moving through the familiar sequence of measures and records with the practiced attention of someone who has done a thing so many times it has become its own form of calm. She thought about the 6th day and the 7th, and what she intended to say when she stood before the senior circle. On the 6th day, Marta came to stand beside her at the preparation table. She did not speak immediately. She assembled a tincture with the unhurried precision that was her signature, and Sandra worked beside her, and they were quiet together for perhaps 10 minutes before Marta said, without looking up from her work, "I have been a healer in this stronghold for 31 years. I have seen 6 beta wolves and 3 alpha kings, and I have seen what happens to a pack when the people in it decide that staying small is the safest way to live." Sandra was still. She continued measuring the compound before her with the same steady attention, but she was listening with everything she had. "What happens?" she asked. Marta finished the tincture. She stoppered it with the same efficient unhurriedness she brought to everything. She said, "It rots. Not loudly. Not all at once. The way a foundation rots, from underneath, in the dark, while everything above it continues to look sound." She paused. "And then one day the floor gives way." She picked up the tincture and turned toward the ward. "I have been watching your floor for 3 years, Sandra." She paused at the door. "I am glad it is giving way now, while there is still someone in the room who knows how to build." She stood at the preparation table for a long time after Marta went into the ward. She stood until the familiar morning sounds, the first patients, the shuffle of boots on stone, the low voice of Dagna greeting someone at the corridor end, had assembled around her into the ordinary music of the day. She stood until she felt, underneath the fear and the weight and the sheer exposed enormity of what the next 24 hours would ask of her, something else. Something that had been there the whole time, she thought, quiet beneath the careful smallness she had built, waiting for her to stop calling it dangerous. She was ready. Not in the way of someone who has run out of fear. In the way of someone who has made a decision that is larger than fear and intends to honor it. Chapter 12. What the Circle Holds. The war room looked different in the configuration of formal review. She had been in it twice before, both times briefly, both times to deliver a medical assessment on a wolf whose injury had bearing on a tactical question. On those occasions the room had been arranged for the working consultation of a small group, informal, functional. The maps still spread on the long table, the chairs pulled close with the casual proximity of men who knew each other well and were used to thinking aloud in the same space. This morning the maps were rolled and stored. The long table had been set against the far wall. The chairs had been arranged in a semicircle facing the hearth, which had been built up to its fullest warmth, and at the open end of the semicircle, facing the 5 senior wolves and the 2 additional chairs that held Tegan and Kale, there was a single chair. Brennan was not in the semicircle. Brennan sat to the left of the single chair, slightly apart from the formal arrangement, in the position of the accused, which carried with it the right to question witnesses, but not to vote on the review's findings. He was very still when she entered. He had the particular stillness of a man who has decided that stillness is the most effective posture available to him, and he wore it well. He looked at her as she crossed the room to the single chair and sat in it, and the quality of that look was different from the measuring look she had seen in the long hall. It was the look of a man who has finished taking measurements and has now begun to calculate. She did not look at Tegan. She understood, with a part of her that had spent 3 years observing the precise social grammar of this pack, that looking at Tegan now would be read as seeking reassurance, and that seeking reassurance would be read as uncertainty, and that uncertainty was exactly the opening Brennan would use. She sat in the single chair with her feet flat and her hands in her lap, and she looked at the senior wolves, all 5 of them, Halvard at the center, old and large and deeply still, with 70 years of pack life behind his eyes and the particular patience of someone who has outlived every urgency he has ever been asked to feel. Halvard opened the review with the formal words, the old language, the pack precedent phrase that had opened every formal review for 200 years, and then he looked at her with those aged, settled eyes and he said, "You have submitted a written account. We have read it. What you are here to do today is speak it aloud, in your own words, and to answer what questions the circle puts to you." He paused. "You are not obligated to add to what you have written. You are not obligated to soften it." He glanced very briefly at Brennan. "You are asked only to be accurate." She was accurate. She gave them everything in the order it had happened, Oren's arrival, the treatment, the account he had given her, the ward records she had filed, Brennan's visit, the exact words he had used, the exact words she had said in return, and the fact that she had not changed the records. She spoke clearly and without embellishment, and without the careful hedging that she had, across 3 years, developed as an automatic response to the discomfort of being fully visible. She was not careful in that way today. She was simply accurate, and the accuracy was its own kind of power, clean and specific and grounded in the actual texture of a real evening in the healing ward with a young man's broken ribs and a beta who had come with a smile and a suggestion that had not quite been a request. When she finished, the circle was quiet for a moment. Then the questions began. They were good questions, specific, sequenced, the kind that tested the internal consistency of an account by coming at the same events from different angles. She answered each one in the same way she had spoken the account, directly, without preemptive apology, marking clearly what she had observed and what she had inferred, and which was which. Then Brennan spoke. He did it the way she had known he would, without volume, without aggression, in the voice of a man who is simply trying to ensure that everyone in the room has a full picture. He said, "Miss Carlson has been in the stronghold for 3 years. She is, as I understand it, not a ranked member of the pack. She is an assistant, a good one by all accounts, with no particular background in enforcement matters or pack law." He paused. "I am not questioning her character. I am asking the circle to consider what a young woman in her position might have understood from a routine conversation about ward records compared with what actually took place." He tilted his head slightly. Memory is not always a precise instrument, especially under the weight of interpretation. She waited until he had finished. She let the silence run for precisely as long as was needed. Then she said, evenly, "I did not interpret the conversation. I recorded it. The cipher entry, which has already been submitted to the circle, was written that same evening." She looked at Brennan steadily. "The exact words you used are in that entry. The exact words I used in response are in that entry. The entry was written in the pack cipher, which is not a language available to someone without specific training, and which I received 3 years ago directly from healer Marta." She paused. "You may question my interpretation of what your words meant. You cannot question what the words were." There was a silence in the room, then that was different from the silences before it. She could feel it, the quality of calculation shifting, the room reorganizing itself around what had just been said. She did not look at Brennan. She looked at Halvard, who was looking at her with the same ancient, patient attention he had brought to every moment of the morning, and something in his face had settled into a new arrangement. Not satisfaction. That was not an expression she associated with Halvard. Resolution. The look of a man who has been waiting a long time for the shape of something to become clear, and has just seen it clearly. Oren came next. He gave his account in the same way he had spoken in the healing ward 3 months ago, careful, precise, without embellishment, with the particular steadiness of someone who has been carrying the truth of a thing for a long time and knows exactly how heavy it is. He did not falter under Brennan's questioning. When Brennan suggested, again in that measured, reasonable voice, that Oren had perhaps misunderstood the nature of the enforcement action, that young wolves, new to the field, sometimes struggled to contextualize decisions made from a broader tactical view, Oren looked at him with calm eyes and said, "I understood the action clearly. What I did not understand was its justification. That is why I asked the question." He paused. "That is still why." After Oren, Kale presented the documentary evidence, the 4 months of enforcement discrepancies, the redirected resources, the authorization trails that ended without the signature they required. He presented it with the thoroughness of a man who has organized information into its most irrefutable form, and he did not editorialize, and he answered every question the circle put to him with the same careful precision that Sandra had brought to her own account. The room grew very quiet and very still. Outside, through the thick walls of the keep, she could hear distantly the ordinary sounds of the stronghold continuing its day, indifferent to what was being decided in this room. She thought this was the strangest thing about important moments, that they happened inside the same continuous texture of ordinary life, and the ordinary life did not pause for them. When Kale finished, Halvard asked the circle to deliberate. The witnesses and the accused withdrew to the adjacent room, a smaller space, a storage antechamber with 1 lamp and 3 chairs, and the smell of old paper, and they waited. Brennan stood at the far end of the room with his back to the wall and his arms folded, and he did not speak, and neither did she, and the silence between them had the particular quality of something that had been built across months and was now in the process of being understood for what it was. She sat in one of the 3 chairs and looked at the lamp and thought about Marta's words, the floor giving way, someone in the room who knows how to build, and she thought about what it would mean to build something in the open, without a floorboard to press it into, without a hollow to keep it small. The circle deliberated for 40 minutes. When they were recalled, Halvard read the finding in the same old language he had used to open the review, and the finding was unanimous. The evidence supported a full audit of the Southern enforcement records, the suspension of the Beta's authority pending that audit, and the formal recognition of the witness accounts as credible and material. He read it without ceremony and without editorial, and when he finished he looked at Brennan for a long moment with those settled ancient eyes and said nothing further. He did not need to. Brennan left the room without speaking. She watched him go, the set of his shoulders, the controlled precision of his exit, the particular stillness of a man who has lost a calculation he believed he had mastered, and she felt something she had not expected. Not triumph, not relief, exactly. Something quieter than both of those. The particular feeling of a truth that has been too long underground finally reaching air. It felt, she thought, like breathing after a long time of not quite breathing. The circle dispersed. Cale spoke briefly to Halvard near the door. Oren, crossing the room toward her, stopped close enough to speak quietly and said, "Thank you." "Just that," she said. "You held it. That was you." He nodded once, a small, precise nod, the nod of someone accepting a thing they have worked for, and then he left, and she was standing in the rearranged war room with the fire burning down in the great hearth, and the afternoon light beginning to come through the long north windows in a way that was unusually warm for the time of year. She heard his footstep before she turned. She knew the particular sound of it, the precise, deliberate pace of a man who does not hurry, and who has learned that arriving steadily is worth more than arriving fast. She turned, and Tegan was crossing the room toward her with a fire behind him and the afternoon light on his face, and he looked at her with the expression she had not known to expect from him and had now seen 3 times and would, she thought, never quite get used to. The expression of a man who has set down the full weight of his authority and is standing in front of her as simply himself. He stopped when he reached her. He did not speak immediately. He was a man who understood that some moments needed to be inhabited for a second before they were addressed. She waited with him inside it. This moment that had been built across 7 days of preparation and 7 years of the pack growing toward something it had not yet known it needed, and she felt the quality of it, enormous and ordinary at once, the way all real things are when you stop managing the distance between yourself and them.
"You held your account," he said.
"Under everything." He said it simply, as a statement of what he had observed, without the inflection of praise, just recognition, which was its own kind of thing and, she had come to understand, was more from him than praise would have been from someone else. "I know what the truth is," she said. "It is easier to hold something when you know what it is." He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said. He paused. "What will you do now?" She thought about the healing ward. She thought about Marta at the preparation table, and Oren with his careful eyes, and the morning compound check that was its own form of steadiness. She thought about the journal on the window ledge in the last of the evening light, sitting there without a floorboard over it, needing nothing to hide it. "Go back to the ward," she said. "There is a follow-up this afternoon I should not miss." She paused. "And then whatever comes next." She looked at him. "Whatever we build." That smallest thing happened at the corner of his mouth again. The almost thing. The warmth of it was, she had discovered over the course of 7 days, considerably more difficult to be near than the composed neutrality she had spent 3 years studying. She was beginning to understand that this was going to be the ongoing condition of whatever came next, the particular difficulty of being close to someone whose full attention was not something she was built to withstand easily, and who she intended to stop trying to withstand. He said, "Then I will see you at evening meal." It was simple and direct and ordinary, the kind of thing people said to each other in the stronghold every day, and it was also entirely not that, and they both understood the difference and did not need to name it. She walked back through the stronghold toward the healing ward. Through the inner courtyard, past the border oaks visible through the east gate, past the long hall where the communal tables were already being set for the evening. The stronghold was going about its ordinary life around her, and she moved through it as she had always moved through it, quietly capable, heading toward work that needed doing. And it was entirely the same and entirely different, the way everything is when you have decided to stop being small, and the world has not collapsed around the decision. That night, she opened the journal one more time. She did not write in it. She simply held it in her hands and looked at what it was. 3 years of the truth of a woman who had believed that the only safe place for what she felt was somewhere hidden, somewhere managed, somewhere no one could reach. She thought about what it had cost her to keep it there. She thought about the floorboard and the watchtower, and the knock that had come through the dark, and the door she had let open. She thought about the war room and Halvard's settled eyes and Oren's small, precise nod. She thought about tomorrow and the day after, and the shape of a life built not on smallness, but on the full, honest weight of what she actually was. She set the journal on the window ledge and looked at it for a long time in the dark. The wolf-bone clasp caught the faint moonlight. The stronghold breathed around her. The deep, slow respiration of an old place that had held many lives within its walls and would hold many more, and which did not distinguish between the ones who had made themselves invisible and the ones who had chosen, at some cost and with some fear and with a quality of decision that could not be unmade, to be seen. She was seen. She had chosen to be. And in the morning she would go to the ward and do the work, and at evening meal, she would sit somewhere other than the lower end of a secondary table, and she would let the stronghold observe whatever it chose to observe, and she would not make herself smaller to accommodate its looking. She had stood still once. She intended to keep standing.
If you enjoy watching this story, please like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.